Welcome to Eliezer May's New Discoveries in the Tanakh. This is hopefully going to be the first in a series. This particular chapter, we will discuss the allegorical meanings of all of the names in the book of Esther. These are secrets which are hidden in plain view, but somehow nobody has ever seen them before. As I said, this is just the first in a series of my new discoveries. It is based on expert knowledge in the biblical Hebrew, Aramaic, and my deep personal connection to our holy scriptures. My goals and objectives throughout this series is to show the brilliant, beautiful literary styles that are employed in the Torah, to show the brilliance in the writing system, to show the brilliance of the Hebrew language, to share my new discoveries in the Siddur, the Torah, and the Tanakh. And today we are going to focus on allegorical names, and we can't really do that in the Torah without touching on the content, the subject as well. So before we begin, we have to understand that all of our holy writings are based in language. Our thinking is based in language, and language is going to have an impact on our studying of the names. Now, names in Hebrew in general have meaning. They are not just random expressions, noises, or sounds, but they have a meaning. And the first issue which arises is spelling changes in the names. And the first example we're going to give of this is Avram and Sarai are blessed by God, and he gives them a letter, the letter Hey, from his name, to add to theirs. So Avram is transformed into Avraham, and Sarai is transformed into Sarah. The next issue is people that have multiple names. So in the example of Yitro or Jethro, the father-in-law of Moshe, he had 7 names: Yitro, Yeter, Chovav, Cheder, Ptuel, Reuel, and Keni. We now move into the aspects of language. And the names that we are going to touch upon here today are in Hebrew, Aramaic, Persian, or Greek, or combinations thereof. The next issue that arises is dialectic transformations. In this case, when you go from one geographic location to another, to one ethnic group or a group of speakers of a language, or from one language to another, letters sometimes transform into different letters. An example would be between Hebrew and Arabic is the transformation in the shin and the sin, or the she and the s sounds. So, for example, we would have shalom in Hebrew and salam in Arabic. That you see the clear connection between the she and the se. In Hebrew to Aramaic, a tzadi can transform either into a tet, like tsur becomes tur, or a tzadi can become an ayin, where we have eretz and ar'ah. The next issue with respect to names is that the name can also be derived for the name of a place. In other words, if a person were from Aram, he might be called Arami. And we have in our scriptures, Arami Oved Avi. We also have another example, Shunamit, who was a woman who came from the area of Shunam. We also have people who are named after their professions. So in the story of Joseph, we have the butler and the baker. We never ever learn what their names are, but we only refer to them by their professions. The next category is names, or our names that are after an animal. So we might have Aryeh, meaning a lion, or Ze'ev, our names in Hebrew. The next issue is generational name recycling. In this case, we are going to have a person with a name, Eliezer, for example, who was the servant of Abraham or Abraham. And then later on, many, many years later, we have Eliezer as the son of Moshe. So in Jewish tradition, we often name a baby after a person who has recently passed away. So we will find the generational name cycles where we don't always know, are we talking about the grandfather or the grandson? We have to be aware of this process. The next issue is transformations in the name based on the position in the sentence and effects of Hebrew grammar. So in this case, a letter may change or a vowel may change if the word falls upon an etnachta, which is the high point in a sentence, or on the sof pasuk, which is the end of the sentence. Similarly, if we add the definitive article, or we have plurals or prefixes and suffixes, it can change the emphasis of the vowels within the word, and consequently there are slight variations to the pronunciations. Hebrew also is a language which really, really likes prefixes and suffixes. And finally, we're going to get to the topic of today's discussion, where names are based on their allegorical meanings. And we will continue and discuss this at length. In order to address any story, it is important to understand the context that the story and all of the events and the people lived in. This is essentially based on the survival requirements, what is going on in terms of war and peace, of prosperity, if they have food, what do they have to do, the technology, the political alliances, empires that are being built, and people that are being enslaved and tortured, and what is going on in history that impacts the people. So we will try to give a rough timeline of the events which lead up to the story which we're going to focus upon today. Approximately 38 to 3900 years ago is when we had Abraham, and it's referred to as 1800 before the Common Era, or BCE. Then we move on to Joseph at approximately 1500 BCE, and he ends up going to Egypt, becoming the second highest in power there after the Pharaoh. A new Pharaoh arises in approximately 1400 BCE and begins the enslavement of the Jewish people. There's about 200 years or so of slavery, and at this point, Moses, rises to the leadership. This is approximately 1300 BCE, or let's roughly say 3300 years ago, and he leads the Jewish people out of Egypt in the Exodus. Next, we have the period of the judges. Then we have the period of the kings, where one of the high points is when, after Saul and David, Solomon, Shlomo, builds the temple in approximately 970 BCE. The next major event is a major catastrophe to the Jewish people, where Nebuchadnezzar, the Babylonian, begins the Babylonian exile, destroys Jerusalem, destroys the temple, and takes the Jewish people, almost all of them, lock, stock, and barrel, to Babylonia. This occurs in approximately 586 BCE. Later on, we have two events that are going to happen. We have Choresh, is the new king of Persia. In English, this would be Cyrus. And he defeats Nebuchadnezzar. Then he is followed by Darius, or Dariush, who encourages and helps with the building or rebuilding of the temple. This is all beginning from 538 and onwards. And then eventually we get to Xerxes, or Ahasuerus, who becomes the king of the Persian Empire in approximately 438. And this is where the story of Esther focuses. Now we're going to drill down and focus on the Babylonian exile, which effectively starts the entire process and story and is one of the worst periods in Jewish history. During this period, the Babylonians conquer Israel and we lose control of the promised land. The next thing that we lose is our writing system. And there are aspects of the Tanakh, the Torah, which are based in the writing system, which people cannot possibly understand today and are lost. And we will discuss some of the discoveries in a different chapter, which are based on the writing system and some of my discoveries there. The next thing that was lost was the daily language or lingua franca. So people, instead of speaking Hebrew, began to speak Aramaic, basically from the area of Aram, which was essentially what we would call Iraq today. This changing of language distanced us. It wasn't any longer our native and natural language, the language of all of our holy scriptures, but it was a related cousin language. So at least with a little effort, you could bridge the gap, but it was still a different language. Then the next major event is that the King Cyrus, or Choresh, defeats the Babylonians, and this was a very, very good thing because Nebuchadnezzar was a cruel and evil dictator, much comparable to what Hitler did in our days, what Pharaoh did back then, and one of many of the tyrants that tortured and hurt the Jewish people horribly. We then move on to, again, Darius, who goes and helps rebuild the temple. And then we get to Xerxes or Achashverosh. And we now have the context under which the story occurs. We will now get back to the main topic of this presentation, which are names and specifically allegorical names. As we mentioned earlier, most names in Hebrew have meaning. Or, in some cases, it is important when a person does not have a name. We'll give an example of a classic person in the story of Joseph. Jacob has sent Joseph to go out and find his brothers. Joseph gets horribly lost. Apparently, he has no place where he can recharge his cell phone. His GPS, he cannot lock onto any of the satellites. And he does what no self-respecting man would ever consider doing. He actually stops, finds a stranger, and he asks for directions. And that kind gentleman tells Joseph where he can find his brothers. And the lesson that we learn from that nameless man is that you never know, that insignificant little act that you never thought about twice, just giving Joseph the directions how to find his brothers, can change and alter the whole course of history. What might have happened if Joseph didn't find his brothers on that day, didn't get thrown into the pit, didn't get sold to the Ishmaelites and sold into to become a servant and a slave, and ultimately save both the Egyptians and the Jewish people from the famine. We now get closer to our topic of discussion, allegorical names. And we'll give an example from a different book amongst the 5 Megillot, or special books. And this book is the book of Ruth. Ruth may come from the word re'ut, meaning friend. And her friendship is obvious throughout the story, and her dedication to her mother-in-law, Naomi. Naomi comes from the word na'im, or nice, pleasant. And she obviously is, as she's won the heart of both of her daughter-in-laws, if not many, many other people along the way. Naomi and her husband Elimelech had to leave the land of Judah to go to Moab because of a horrible famine. And they live there for 10 years. And they have two sons that they bring, which are Machlon and Chilion. Now, these are not their real names. Machlon comes from the word machala, or sickness, and Chilion comes from the word finished, lechalot, chila. So Machlon effectively is sicko, and Chilion is goner, as both of them die in Moab and never return, and do not apparently have children. The next person, the last person in our list of examples, would be Boaz, a hero also in this story, who befriends Ruth, protects, shelters her, and ultimately takes her to be his wife and becomes the forefather of King David. And what does Boaz mean? Bo means within him. Az is the strength. So Boaz means the strength within him, as he was a valiant, good, and kind man. Another technique for the analysis of a biblical work is to look at all of the other contemporary texts. I have read and analyzed all of the following: the book of Esther, the book of Daniel, Echa or Lamentations, Ezra, Nehemiah, and Chronicles 1 and 2, Divrei Hayamim Aleph Bet. As we go through this presentation, we will be looking at the impact of Hebrew, Aramaic, Persian, Greek, and sometimes Latin on the storyline, on the words, the names, as they become relevant. And now we will dive into the story in Megillat Esther, beginning with chapter 1. And it was in the days of Achashverosh, and Achashverosh was ruling from India to Ethiopia, 127 countries. In those days, when the king Achashverosh sat on the throne of his kingdom, which was in Shushan, the capital, and it was the 3rd year of his reign, that he made a party for all of his officers and his servants, the armies of Persia, Media, and all of the officers of all of the countries before him. And he wanted to show off all of his wealth in the honor of his kingdom. And this party lasted for 180 days. And now we will analyze the first significant name that appears in Megillat Esther, the book of Esther, is Achashverosh. This is built on 2 words. We take off the prefix a, which doesn't contribute anything, and we then are left with 2 words, chash verosh. Chash means to sense or to feel. And Rosh, albeit it is with a spelling mistake, Rosh normally is spelled with an Aleph, but there is another place which I found in the Talmud which also makes exactly the same mistake. But Rosh means head, signifying thinking, analysis. So when someone risks their lives and comes to plead before the king must sense their sincerity and analyze their motives. This is Achashverosh. The next name in this case is a name of the city, the capital city, Shushan. It says in the story, Ve'amudei shesh, and pillars of marble. It also says al ritzpat bahat vashesh, on floors made of some kind of a stone and marble as well. So Shushan can possibly mean the marbled city, in testimony to the splendor of this magnificent city, which was the capital of the Persian Empire, Shushan. And the story continues, and Vashti the queen made a party for all of the women in the palace of the king Ahasuerus. And it was on the seventh day, when the king was good and drunk, that he told Mehuman, Bizta, Chavona, Bigta, Avakta, Zetar, and Charkas, the 7 eunuchs or officers that served the king Ahasuerus, to bring Vashti the queen before the king in the crown of the kingdom, to show all of the peoples and all of the officers her beauty, because she was very beautiful. So as the story begins, we see the hierarchy. The first significant name is the king, Ahasuerus, and the second name, the second person, is the queen, Vashti. And so what does Vashti mean? It was an allegorical name. Vashti comes from the 2 components, Va, Sheti. Va meaning and, sheti, and in the imperative form, you will drink. Whether you want to or not, you are going to participate in my festivities and do what I want, whether you want to or not. Now we move forward to a list of 7 ministers that served the king. And remembering that Mehuman, or Haman, was the one who was told to go and to retrieve and bring Vashti to the party of the king, and Vashti refuses. So let's take a look at the name Mehuman. Mehuman, and later on in chapter 3 we will see Haman, were one and the same person. Mehuman is in the passive form, but later on we're going to hear in chapter 3, אחר הדברים האלה גידל המלך אחשוורוש את המן. After these things passed, the king promoted Haman and changed him from the passive form into the active form. So what does Haman come from? There are 2 possible derivations of the word. The first and most likely is mano. Mano means to count. So Haman and Mehuman evaluated and measured everything in terms of money and power. We also have in modern Hebrew, or the common word which is used today, minyan, because you must count and achieve a quorum of 10 people to have a minyan. This comes from the root mano, to count. An alternative interpretation to the name Haman is the crusher. In chapter 9 we read, Ki Haman ben Hamedata Hagagi צורר כל היהודים חשב על היהודים לאבדם והפיל פור הוא הגורל להומם ולאבדם. This means that Haman the Agagite, who was the hater of the Jews, thought about the Jews with the intention to destroy them, and he cast the lot, that is the lot of the lottery, to go and to crush them, lehumam ul abdam, and to destroy them. Another interesting aspect of the word le'abedam is to destroy them. The last part of the word bedam means in blood, or in cold-blooded murder is what he intends to do. We now move forward to the second person in the list, Bizeta. Bizeta means the despiser. Levazot is to despise. We bring you some examples from Nehemiah or Nehemiah, and also later on we have the quote within the book of Esther, Lehavzot ba'alehem beinehem, that the Mukhan says about the women that they would despise their husbands. We now move to the third of the ministers in the list, and he is Charvona. Charvona comes from the root cherev. We also see another instance of the word in chuban, or destruction. Cherev means sword, and chuban again means destruction. Later on we will find that when the king essentially has decreed that Haman is going to die, it is Charvona, who is 2 positions behind Mehuman or Haman, who goes and tells the king to hang Haman on the gallows that he has prepared for the Jew Mordecai, who saved the king and was a good person, and effectively this comes to pass. The fourth and the fifth names of the ministers are from the same root, Bigta and Avagta. So you can hear the similarity in the names. Let's just do a short aside that when you have the A followed by an Aleph at the end of a word in Aramaic, this is the definitive article, the something or other. And the root here, I maintain, is bagad, to betray or to be a traitor. And so what we have is a transformation between the Taf and the Dalid, where these are both dental letters according to the classes of Sadia Gaon and in linguistics in general, that they are pronounced at the same place in the mouth. We also see instances of the interchange in the Hitbael form. When it occurs after a zayin, the taf becomes a dalit. The next name, the sixth name in the list, is Zetar. Now, Zetar is not very important to our storyline. He's just one more minister who really has no role to play in terms of the story, but the name could possibly emanate from the Greek word kithara, and this was some kind of a harp or a musical instrument. In modern English, we have zither, which may be related. So Zetar might have been in the courtyard, in the primary people that were there, an entertainer, a musician. And now we get to the last minister in the list of the seven ministers, and his name is Chalkas. So his name may emanate from the Latin circus, circas, and he might have well been an entertainer. Now we will return to our storyline and analyze one of the very important words that occurs in our story. The word is cheter. Before we get into the misinterpretation, and one of the stupidest things I've ever heard for the meaning that is often attributed to the word, we'll look at the word linguistically. The word keter, kether, keser, in its variation of pronunciations, means a crown. From this word, we get the name of Caesar, directly related. We also get Kaiser in Germany, the ruler in World War I. We also have Tsar in Russia. We also have Mukhtar, is the leader in an Arab political structure. And I think we got all of the common names. Now, getting back to the story. I have heard it said in one of the interpretations that the king had commanded Vashti to come in the crown of the kingdom and nothing else. This is absolutely ludicrous. This is absolutely without any support, without any possibility whatsoever. The word keter means in many languages, or almost all languages, the crowning touch. When you wear the most regal of all garments, and you have a crown that could be weighing 20, 30 pounds with all kinds of jewels and gems and ornaments and who knows what, that is not something that you wear around the house lightly. It's something that completes the picture. And we're going to see later on in chapter 6, when Haman is incensed with the idea of murdering Mordecai, and he's built this gallows, he goes to the king, and the king asks him, what would you do to someone that the king wants to show favor to him? And Haman responds that you should bring him dressed in the royal garb, the royal robes, which the king himself had worn, and with the horse that the king himself had ridden upon, and you should place the crown of the kingdom on his head. In other words, the picture is not complete until you add the final element, the crown. We also remember in the story when you have the beauty contest and the king effectively decides to choose Esther, and he says, Vayasem keter malchut beroshah. Vayamlichea tahat Vashti, and he placed the crown of the kingdom on her head, and he appointed her in place of Vashti. So the keter, the crown, was an essential part of the process of the coronation, making her officially the queen, and until that was not done, the act was not completed. We now return to the storyline. The problem has arisen. The king has ordered Vashti to come before him, and she refused. So the king now turns to the wise men, those who know the times and are knowledgeable about the law. And the closest one to him, and now they have a list of 7 wise men, are Karshena, Shetar, Admata, Tarshish, Meres, Marsena, and Memuchan, the 7 officers of Persia and Media who see the face of the king that sit in the first row of the empire. What, according to the law, should be done with the Queen Vashti because she did not obey the orders of the King Ahasuerus that were given by the ministers. The names of the ministers are not of major importance, and in fact, after the advice is given, we never ever hear of these ministers again. Possibly they were put to death. We really don't know. We don't have any further information. But we will begin with the first name, Karshena. And one possibility is that it connects to the name Koresh, the good king who defeated Nebuchadnezzar. And we see that, but at the same time, it is also possible that it is a root in Persian that appears in many names. We have no definitive information, but it's interesting. In Ezra, we hear Vishnat achat lechoresh melech Paras, in the first year of the king of Persia, Koresh. The second name is Shetar, and we find in Ezra chapter 6 the name of a person, Shetar Boznai. Again, not a major important character at all. The third name is Admata, and in Aramaic, Admata means the land. So the way you derive Aramaic in the case of the definitives, you take the word, which would be Adama in Hebrew, change it into the construct form Admat, then we add the Kamatz Aleph at the end, making it Admata, and we have the land. So it's most likely someone who has an association with land, a landowner, someone who is of importance with the association to land. The fourth person in the list is Tarshish, and Tarshish was the name of a place. We see this in Kings 1, chapter 10, verse 22, and it usually is the name of a person who comes from a specific place. However, in Persian, it also means His Excellency, feared or revered, and the word might mean in Hebrew to grind something. We also know of a place which one went to by the sea. Now, an alternative variation of it is in the Aramaic, and just like we saw in Admata, we add the construct form, making it from Tirshat to Tirshat, and then add the A, making it Tirshata. The next 2 people are the 5th and the 6th. Similarly, we saw the list before were in similar position. They throw out 2 names that are obviously interconnected, but we really don't have very good information about these particular names, Meres and Marsena. And the closest I can come up with was the Roman gods Mars, but really there's nothing to support that. We finally arrive at the last name, the seventh name in the list, which is Memuchan. Memuchan comes from the word lachin, which is someone who prepares. So he is the one who opens his big mouth. He's the least important, the seventh in a list of seven ministers, and he is the one who prepares the stage for everything that is going to happen in this story. Getting back to the story, we now begin the second chapter. After these things transpired, and the wrath of the king subsided, the king Ahasuerus remembered Vashti and what she did and what was decreed upon her. And he said to the boys of the king that were his servants, that they should go out and seek out virgin girls that are beautiful. It should be noted here the words that was decreed upon her. In the kingdom of Ahasuerus, once the king ordered something, made an edict, it was not to be retracted. So even though the punishment had not been carried out, and even though we don't know what that punishment is, it was to be carried out, and it could not be changed once the word had left his mouth. And now we introduce the main characters of our story, and we learn the plot. There was a Jewish man from Shushan, the capital, and his name was Mordecai, and he was the son of Yair, who was the son of Shimei, who was the son of Kish, and they were from the tribe of Benjamin. And they came with the exiles from Jerusalem, with the great Babylonian exile, with Jeconiah, the king of Judah, that also came with the exiles of Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylonia. And he was the mentor of Hadassah, who was Esther, the daughter of his uncle, because she had no father or mother. And the girl was beautiful, and beautiful to look upon. And when her father and mother died, Mordecai took her in to be as though she were his daughter. It is important here to understand the context. The context and all of the problems begin with the evil king Nebuchadnezzar, the Babylonian king, who came to the promised land, sacked the temple, destroyed Jerusalem, and murdered countless numbers of people. And then he took most of the people and dragged them forcibly to Babylonia, which would be today the area of Iraq. It should be noted that there is a connection point between the scroll of Esther, Megillat Esther, and the book of Lamentations here, with the fact that Mordecai was in exile, who had come there because of the destruction and Babylonian exile in Jerusalem and in the Promised Land. Both the book of Esther and Lamentations have their own distinct cantillations. And it is traditional here that it begins with the cantillation of the scroll of Esther and then transitions into the cantillation of Lamentations and then returns. This is the way that it is read. Ish Yehudi haya Beshushan Abira Ushmo Mordechai ben Yair ben Shimei ben Kish ish Yemini Asher Hagela Mirushalayim Imagola Asher Hogleta Im Yechonia Melech Yehuda Asher Hegla Nebuchadnezzar Melech Bavel. So now we look at Mordecai and analyze his name. Mordecai has two meanings, two emanations for his name, two derivations. In Hebrew, the root is mored, or to rebel, and the play in the Persian is on the Persian god Marduk. So what had happened here is that Mordecai would be in the gate of the kingdom, and imagine a city with a wall protecting the people inside, and one gate where everyone would enter and exit, and all of the shops and other things in the proximity of the gate. This was the most volatile and active area of the city. And in this place, when Haman had received the orders and the authorization of the king, everyone was commanded to bow down to Haman. But there in the very, very volatile location, Mordecai was rebelling. He was standing up while everyone is bowing down, sticking out like a sore thumb, and no one could help but see that he was there. Now, we also read in Nehemiah or Nehemiah about the rebellion, where the Jews were thinking about rebelling. This is in chapter 6, and then in chapter 7, we also hear about Mordecai Bilshan, meaning Mordecai the linguist. And later on in the story, when we hear about the two bodyguards that are plotting to assassinate the king, the reason that Mordecai was able to undo their plot and thwart their plot was because he spoke many languages. The next name is Nebuchadnezzar, who was the evil king of Babylonia. And we note that the beginning of his name is Navuch, or bewildered or perplexed or troublesome, and possibly at the end, narrow or hatred. And we read the word later on, V'ha'ir Shushan Navocha. And once the orders came out to go and to murder and annihilate all the Jews, it says that the city of Shushan was confused or perplexed. But in actuality, what the author is doing is making a play on the name of Nebuchadnezzar, that they were Nebuchadnezzarized. They were taken back to the time a few decades ago where Nebuchadnezzar had terrorized, had created the worst Holocaust in Israel, in the Promised Land, murdering the people and dragging them off, destroying the temple, destroying the city of Jerusalem. And this horrible memory comes back to haunt them as they are confronted with their imminent destruction. And it also says that Tsar, meaning that someone who was narrow-minded, and it also says about Haman, who was the hater, the narrow-minded, and the enemy. So we see that Tsar reference in the name of Nebuchadnezzar again. Also Tzorer, someone who is entrenched in hatred. Next, we learn about Hadassah, which was Esther's Hebrew name. It's interesting and important to note that she had two distinct identities, her Jewish identity and her Persian identity, the public one that she had to display. The name Hadassah comes from Hadass, and we read in Nehemiah, Ale Hadass va'ale Tmarim, so it clearly was the name of some form of plant or vegetation that had leaves. And this is not unusual for female names to derive from some kind of a plant, such as a rose, a lily, or other beautiful flowers. And now we will explore Esther's name. Her name comes from both Hebrew and Persian. In the Persian version, we have Ishtar or Astarte, and in the Hebrew, we have the root seter, which means a secret, because Esther was commanded by Mordecai not to reveal her nationality or her people. As the story continues, you have the beauty contest where all the girls are gathered to the palace of the king, and the person who is to watch over them is called Shashgaz. And the derivation possibly, again, we don't have strong evidence of this, and it, again, is not really very, very important, but gaz or gez is the act of shearing sheep. As the story continues, Mordecai is sitting in the gate of the kingdom, and he overhears two people, Bigtan and Teresh, plotting to assassinate the king. So we look at the two names. Bigtan is very, very similar to what we saw before, Bigtana and Avagta, which again, as we mentioned earlier, derives from the word to betray, boged, and Teresh has a number of possibilities. The most likely one of all of them is that it comes from the shortened version of Tarshish, who was mentioned in the list of the wise people. But there is also the possibility of Shetar, where it is the same letters, but the order is mixed up. Again, it's really not very, very important, the emanation of that name, but let's leave it with Tarshish. Another important fact that arises from the story is that it says that they held an inquiry. They found that the allegations were true, and they hung both of these two people who plotted to assassinate the king on a gallows, and then it was written in the Chronicles before the king. The other aspect that is important to note is that in their legal system, it wasn't enough just to accuse someone, but the accusations and allegations required proof. It had to be proven before you could carry out the verdict. The other thing is the verdict itself, that the fact that they were going to hang the two of them on a gallows is a precursor to what is going to happen with Haman at the end of our story. Also, the fact that things are written in the Chronicles, which also connects to the book of Chronicles, which is a contemporary text to Lamentations and the book of Esther, but it also is the king had his own version of the Chronicles, which ultimately was where he was going to find it recorded, the information, and have the connection point to Haman when Haman comes in the middle of the night to recommend hanging Mordecai on the gallows, and this mention of the gallows interconnects and becomes his undoing. We now move on to chapter 3. And after these things came to pass, and the king Ahasuerus promoted Haman the Agagite, and he lifted him and placed him on his seat above all of the ministers which were with him. This again relates to him being promoted and changing from the passive form to the active form. It is also important to note that Agag was the king of the Amalekites, and in the book of Numbers they attacked the Jews. They went out of their way to attack the Jews. And not only that, they attacked from the rear, where you had the elderly, the sick, and the infants, at the weakest people who were the most vulnerable. And the Torah issues the edict that these people must be eradicated. And now in this story, suddenly the roles are reversed, and it is the same Amalekites who are essentially threatening to eradicate the Jewish people. The irony of the story. And now we reach the point of crisis, the point of conflict, which causes the whole problem. And all of the servants of the king, which are in the gate of the king, are bowing down and prostrating themselves to Haman, because so commanded the king. And Mordecai would not bow, and he would not prostrate himself. And the servants of the king said to him that were in the gate of the king to Mordecai, why are you transgressing the commands of the king? And it came to pass, as they said, time after time, day in and day out, and that he would not listen to them. And then finally they told Haman that Mordecai told them he was doing this because he was a Jew, and implicitly the Jews were not allowed to bow down to someone. Here began the root of the problem. And now we learn about depravity at its worst. We begin with the word vayivez be'enav, and it was despised in his eyes, or it looked bad to go and to attack Mordecai by himself, because Mordecai had said that who his nationality, who his people were. And Haman decided to destroy the entire Jewish people that were in the kingdom of Ahasuerus, the people of Mordecai, guilt by association. And all Jews were expendable so long as it would serve his purpose, and he would get that one man, the one person, to get him, he would kill an entire nation. And so Haman goes to the king Ahasuerus, and he says, there is one people that are scattered, and they are distinct and separate from all of the other nations in all of the countries of your kingdom. And their religion is different from all of the people and the religion of the king. And they do not do what the king wishes, and it isn't worth even allowing them to exist. It's as though he's saying that you can't even ignore them. It's a cancer that is going and eating and destroying you because they are different than everyone else. You can't allow people to be nonconformists, to have their own ways of behavior, their own religion, their own dietary laws, their own norms. You can't even allow such a thing to exist. They must be eradicated. And Haman continues to speak to the king. If it's all right with the king, it should be written to lose these people, and 1,000 golden coins shall be measured for those who do the task, to be brought to the treasury of the king. And the king removed his ring from his hand, and he gave it to Haman the Agagite, the hater of the Jews. And the king said to Haman, the money has been given, and for the people to do with it whatever you like. It should be noted, the idea of this euphemism, they should be lost. It is not nice to say murder or to say genocide, but if you say ethnic cleansing, that's sanitary, that's clean. It's a nice way to accomplish this dirty task. So all of a sudden he uses terminology to lose them, which is more palatable and acceptable a term. The story continues, and they called the scribes of the king on the first month and the 13th day, and they wrote all that was commanded by Haman to, and now we have a list of all of the government ranks. Achashdarpenei Hamelech, Hapachot are the two ranks, and of all of the countries and the ministers and the people and the countries, each one according to their language, each nation according to their language, and in the name of the king Ahasuerus it was written, and it was sealed with the signet ring of the king. There are a number of very important points that come out of this. The idea of communications, just like the 4 sons in the Seder, that you speak to each person in their language, at their intellectual and developmental level. So there is a mindset here that is very, very in tune with how you speak to different people, even though the mission and the task is very unpalatable and undesirable. We're going to also continue in the next slide where we talk about the different ranks of the different people. Now we will address the ranks. It says, Achashdarpenei Hamelech ve'el hapachot. We will reference the book of Daniel in chapter 3, and it says that Nebuchadnezzar the king sent, and they now mentioned the Michnash La Achashtarpenaya. Then it continues with Signaya, Pachavata, Adragazraya, Gedavraya, Detavraya, Tiflaya, and all of the other ranks or rulers of the country. Whatever Michnash is, we really don't know, but apparently that would have been the highest order. The second order would be Achashtarpenim, but again, this is in the Aramaic plural form. The second in command, although in this case it would be the third in command in the ordering, but the next level down is Sgan, or a vice or associate. Then you have the Pachot is the lessers, which would be the fourth ranking in this list, and then it goes down the list to all the other ones until Tiflaya, Tafel, typically means the unimportant, the insignificant, and those that were the rulers or leading ranks of the country. We now look at the word Achashtarpeneh. I think that it comes from two words. Chashad is to be suspicious. Peneh is the face. In other words, these were people who might have been looking at the faces of the people coming before the king as the bodyguards and trying to sense if anyone were to go and to attempt to assassinate the king by analyzing their facial movements and their other motions in order to identify threats against the king. And again, Pachot is simple, lesser, in terms of its Hebrew origins. The deed was done, the books have been written, and now they had to be distributed. And ancient Persia had the first massive postal system to go and disseminate the information in the hands of the runners to all of the kingdoms, all of the countries of the king, to destroy, to murder, to lose all the Jews, from the young lads until the older people, from the infant to the women, all in one day, on the 13th day of the 12th month, which was the month of Adar. And the people who would commit these atrocities were permitted to go and to loot and to take everything that they owned as well. Very, very reminiscent to what we know from our own Holocaust, not that very long ago. The books were written, the books were distributed, and the translation of what was written was enacted into the law of each country, and it was out in the open. It was revealed to all of the people, and that they were instructed to be prepared for that very day. And the runners went out, impressed with the urgency according to the word of the king, and the law had been enacted and given in Shushan, the capital, and the king and Haman sat down to drink, and the city of Shushan was perplexed. First of all, the word Patshegen, we will talk about that in a moment. It really should have been Parshegen, and we will get to that. But the word we're going to focus on now is V'ha'ir Shushan Navocha. While the literal meaning is perplexed, it really takes us back to the beginning origin of the word Nebuchadnezzar, Navoch. It's as though the same Holocaust, the same tragedy which had confronted the Jewish people but a few decades earlier in the Promised Land, where they faced annihilation, destruction of the temple, and all of the evil of Nebuchadnezzar, they were now being Nebuchadnezzarized, as Navoch and Nebuchadnezzar are integral one to another, and this same catastrophe was coming full circle to attack them one more time. Now we'll revisit the word Patshegen. First of all, we must remember that during this period of the Babylonian exile, we lost our writing system, the ancient Hebrew, and we began using what we used called Ashurit or Assyrian until this very day is what we use, but people were in the process of transitioning from the ancient writing system to this new writing system. And if we look in the book of Ezra, we see the word used exactly in the same context as parshegen. So looking at the similarity, if we take off the piece on the left-hand side, we see that the tav can be converted into a resh. But the irony is that the very expression is talking about the writing system, parshegen or parshegen haktav. But in Ezra, it's more likely than not speaking about the translation of these books into all of the different languages so that it could be distributed to each of the countries in their own respective languages, which makes a lot of sense. We now continue in the story to chapter 4, and Mordecai knew all that had transpired. And Mordecai ripped his clothes, and he wore sackcloth and ashes. And he went out in the middle of the city, and he cried out a great and bitter cry. And Esther called Hathach, of the officers and people that were assigned by the king, pointed to her, and he commanded him to go out to Mordecai and to find out what is going on. What is this all about? So we now have another person in the picture. This is the person called Hathach. Hathach comes from the Hebrew word toch. Toch means in the middle, in the midst. And so Hathach goes back and forth between Mordecai and between Esther, conveying messages, transferring items back and forth as he is the middleman. And interestingly enough, the author of the book of Esther wants to make sure you don't miss it. So he even uses the word vayetze betoch ha'ir. He even uses the word toch there to give you a hint. You should be looking for this technique, which I'm going to use with the name of Hathach. So Mordecai explains the situation, and Esther responds explaining that she has not been invited before the king, and here is the severity of this situation. Mordecai blows up, and he responds to Esther. He says, "Don't you even think of saving yourself, because you have it nice in the palace of the king, better than all of the Jews. And if you are silent at this time, and you are deaf to the situation, then salvation shall come from another place for the Jews, and you and the house of your father shall perish. And who knows, if you did not achieve your position in the kingdom for the purpose of saving the Jews now." Returning to the language, that you should not imagine, dimayon, but it uses it, and interestingly enough, again the word dam appears here, blood, that the blood would in some way be on your hands if you do not take action. Now you are compelled. Each of us are told that we cannot be deaf to the plight of our brethren, and we must take action if that is what is necessary, in whatever ways that we can. And we saw what had happened in the Holocaust under the Nazis. This is exactly the same situation, where we must stand and we must fight, comrades of arms, together in the face of our destruction. If instead we focus on fighting each other, and we can give enough examples of J Street, of the Neturei Karta, of other people that have lost the true way of Judaism. If you look through the book of Ezra, Daniel, Nehmiah, the history of how the Jews fought, and the people who now shirk their responsibilities in the face of anti-Semitism, in the face of all of the anti-Semitic nations and people who are working to destroy us. This is what the book of Esther is trying to teach us with this passage here. Do not be deaf stand and unite. Kol Yisrael arevim ze bazeh. All Jews are responsible for each other and must stand shoulder to shoulder in the face of anti-Semitism, in the face of those who seek our destruction, and put aside our differences. Otherwise, we will perish. And Esther responds to Mordecai, but she does not say a single word, because there is absolutely no possibility that she would have abrogated her responsibility. It is implicit, it is understood, as she instructs Mordecai, go and gather all the Jews that are found in Shushan and fast for me, and don't eat and don't drink for 3 days and nights. And I and my girls will also fast as such. And as such I will come to the king, which is not according to the law, which is not on the docket. And if I shall perish, then so shall it be. And Mordecai passed, and he did exactly what Esther had commanded him. And after the party with the king and the queen, Haman went out, happy and content that day. But when he saw Mordecai in the gate of the king, he would not arise, nor would he move from it. And Haman was full of anger against Mordecai. But he restrained himself, and he went home. And then he sent and he called to all his lovers and to his wife Zeresh as well. And all of this is not worth anything to me, because all the while that I see Mordecai the Jew sitting in the gate of the king. And so Haman was obsessed. All the good fortune, everything, his power, meant absolutely nothing as long as Mordecai continued to anger and antagonize him by not standing and respecting and bowing down to Haman, the evil, wicked enemy of the Jews. And Zeresh, his wife, along with his lovers and supporters, told Haman that he should build a gallows 50 cubits high, and in the morning he should go and tell the king that they should hang Mordecai on this gallows, and go to the king, to the party, happy and content. And the matter was seen as good in the eyes of Haman, and he built the gallows. We continue to chapter 6. And on that night the king was restless, he could not sleep, and he asked his servants to bring the book of remembrances, where it was written in the Chronicles, and they were read before the king. And it was found that Mordecai the Jew told the king about the plot to go and assassinate him by Bigtana and Teresh, the 2 ministers from the bodyguards of the king, that they wanted to go and to assassinate the king Ahasuerus. And it is late in the middle of the night, and the servants had just completed reading the episode from the book of Chronicles about Mordecai saving the king from the assassination plot. And the king asked, who is in the courtyard? And Haman had come to the courtyard, the outer courtyard of the king, to tell him to hang Mordecai on the gallows which he had already built for him. And the boys, the servants of the king, tell the king that, behold, it is Haman who is standing in the outer courtyard. And the king says, enter. And so Haman enters, and the king is still thinking about the story with Mordecai, but he doesn't want to say who it is, and hypothetically asks Haman, what should be done to a person that the king wishes to honor and bestow honor upon him? And Haman, with his ego in his heart, asks, Who other than myself would the king want to honor in such a way? And Haman responds to the king that a man who the king wishes to honor should be brought in the garb, in the royal gowns of the kingdom, that even the king himself had worn, and with the horse which the king himself had ridden upon him. And you should crown this picture by placing the crown of the kingdom on his head. And the king responds to Haman, "Hurry up, go and take the royal garbs and the horse, exactly as you said, and do to Mordecai the Jew that sits in the gate of the king. Don't leave out a single thing from everything that you said." And so the king shows that he is fully aware of everything that has been transpiring. He knows about Mordecai. He knows that Mordecai is a Jew. He knows exactly where Mordecai constantly sits. And you can assume that he knows all of the rest of the story and the conflict between Haman and Mordecai. And even as it is still in the middle of the night, Haman goes and gathers all of the clothing, the horse, and everything that is required, goes to find Mordecai, and he parades Mordecai through the city, shouting before him, "So shall it be done to a man that the king wishes to bestow honor upon him." And Haman completes the task and returns. And Mordecai also returns to the gate of the king, and Haman is pushed into his home, and he is in mourning, and he has his head covered. And Haman tells his wife Zeresh and all his lovers and supporters all that had happened to him. And the wise people tell him back, and his wife as well, that if Mordecai is from the seed of the Jews, then you have begun to fall before them, and you will not be able to survive, because you shall surely fall before them. We now move on to chapter 7. Before Haman has even had a chance to recover and recuperate from his task of leading Mordecai through the city, the servants come to gather him to take him to the party. And once more, in the second party, the king approaches the queen and asks her, "What is your request? What is your favor until half the kingdom, and it shall be granted?" And the queen responds that my request is my life, and my favor is saving my people from the destruction which has been brought upon them. The king asks, "Who would do such a thing?" And Esther, the queen, responds, "This evil Haman is the person who is responsible." And the king arises in his anger, but knowing that if he says anything, he might say the wrong thing, and his word cannot be retracted. So he immediately goes out into the garden to think things over. And then, as he returns from the garden, he suddenly sees in the party that Haman approaches the queen to ask for his life, knowing that his life is in serious jeopardy. And as he does so, he trips and he falls and lands on the bed which Esther is sitting on. And the king, in his anger, for the first time speaks out without hesitation and asks, "Do you also want to conquer the queen with me still in the house?" And as soon as the words left his mouth, and Haman's face was either red or was covered. In this episode, we see the word chafui and chafu coming from the same root, and we can connect the word to chuppah, a canopy or a covering. And it is traditional that you do not gaze upon a dead person. So the moment that Haman had returned from parading Mordecai through the city, and it says that his face was in mourning, and his head was covered, already giving a sign and a signal as though he had already committed the act and that he was dead. later on, it completes this segment where after falling on the bed with the queen, it says, Ufnei Haman chafu, and the face of Haman was covered. At this point, he is as good as dead. And as fate would have it, it was just the night before that Haman, obsessed with his hatred and wanting to have Mordecai hung on the gallows that he had built for Mordecai the Jew, and now with his fate already established that he is going to die, Chavona, one of the officers who was 2 positions down from Mehuman in the list of advisors to the king at chapter 1, speaks up and says to the king that Haman has built a gallows and he should be hung on his own gallows which he had prepared for Mordecai. We spoke good to the king and saved his life, and the gallows stands in the house of Haman, 50 cubits high, and the king says, hang him on it. And they hung Haman on the gallows which he had prepared for Mordecai, and the anger of the king subsided. And here we see in the name Chavona once more. The name comes from sword or destruction. As he sticks it into Haman, he brings about the destruction of Haman. In compensation for what he wanted to do to Mordecai, he's hung on the very gallows which he intended to kill Mordecai, becomes the place where he meets his demise. The literary style which is employed here, they always use requests in pairs. What is your request and what is your favor? And now Esther is confronted and left with a horrible situation, albeit Haman is now dead, but the edict, the law that was issued in the name of Ahasuerus the king still remains. And Esther says to the king, if I found favor before you, and if everything is all right in the eyes of the king, it should be written to return, to retract the books, the intentions of Haman the Agagite, the hater of the Jews, that wrote to destroy the Jews in all of the countries of the king. And how can it be that I shall see the evil that shall befall my people? And how can I see the destruction of my heritage? Here we get the connection once more to the book of Lamentations. How can this happen? How can I see this happen to my people? As she pleads before the king for their lives. And then the king Ahasuerus says to Esther, and somehow or other, magically Mordecai the Jew as well, behold the house of Haman I have given to Esther, and Haman himself they hung on the gallows that he had planned to kill the Jews. And now go and write for the Jews that which you see fit in the name of the king, and sign it and seal it with the signet ring of the king, that it should be written in the name of the king, and it should be sealed with the signet ring of the king. That which is written cannot be retracted. There are no erasers in Shushan. And it was written in the name of the king Ahasuerus, and it was sealed with the signet ring of the king. And they sent out books in the hands of the runners and on the riders of the horses to all of the countries, that the king had granted the Jews in all of the cities, every cities, the right to gather, to stand and defend themselves against the destruction and the death, along with the armies of all of the countries that were plotting against them, from child and woman, and all of their spoils they were allowed to steal. And how amazing and how revolutionary was it that the king encouraged and granted the Jews the right to stand up and to defend themselves against all of the anti-Semitic people who conspire and plot and will be satisfied with nothing less than the murder, destruction, and genocide of the Jews. And the Jews have the right to defend themselves. And on the same day, in all of the countries of the king Ahasuerus, on the 13th day of the 12th month, which was Adar, the translation of the edict was given of the law in all of the countries, every country, and it was revealed to all of the people that the Jews should be prepared for that day to extract revenge from their enemies, and the runners and the horse riders and everyone went out with the imperative cause according to the word of the king, and the law had been given in Shushan, the capital. And Mordecai went out before the king in the royal garb of the kingdom, and the city of Shushan was joyous and happy. And for the Jews there was light and happiness and joy and preciousness. And in all of the countries, each country, and in every city and city, every place which the word of the king and his law reached, there was happiness and joy for the Jews. And it was a great celebration and a great joyous day. And many of the people of the land converted to Judaism because the fear of the Jews descended upon them. ליהודים הייתה אורה ושמחה, ששון ויקר. This expression, the idea of light as a major symbol of importance in the Middle East, after the darkness of the period of Nebuchadnezzar, and once again what threatened the Jews with extinction, suddenly there was light and there was happiness and joy. To understand the concept of light, one must understand that in the Middle East, until maybe some 50 years ago, in Egypt, for example, 25% of the population was blind. There is nothing more important in Middle Eastern cultures than light. In Arabic, if you wanted to say that somebody is precious, the most dear thing to you, you would say to them in Arabic, ayuni, meaning you are as precious to me as my eyes. And this is something that we have to understand, the culture and the motivations behind some of the symbolisms that can so easily be taken for granted. And the Jews gathered in their cities in every country of the king Ahasuerus to attack those that would seek their destruction. And no man stood before them, because the fear of the Jews fell upon all of the nations. And all of the officers of the countries and the Ahashtarpenim, the protectors and the lessers that do the work of the king, would support the Jews, because the fear of Mordecai fell upon them, because Mordecai was a great man in the house of the king, and his name went out before him in all of the countries, because the man Mordecai was becoming greater and greater. And so concludes the book of Esther, but it doesn't end. It says in chapter 9, והימים האלה נזכרים ונעשים בכל דור ודור, משפחה ומשפחה, מדינה ומדינה ועיר ועיר, וימי הפורים האלה לא יעברו מתוך היהודים, וזכרם לא יסוף מזרם. And these days are remembered and celebrated in every generation, in each family and family, in every country and country, in every city and city. And the days of Purim, these days, will never pass from the midst of the Jews, and their remembrance will never end for all of our generations, because there is always another rocket, another tunnel, another anti-Semite, another person seeking to destroy the Jews. And we must remain steadfast. We must unite to protect each other from our enemies. And now some final thoughts. In the book of Ezra, we read about the connection to the first major Holocaust, that of the enslavement in Egypt, the murder of the firstborn, and all of that tragic story. In the book of Daniel, we read about Nebuchadnezzar's dream, and he dreams of a great tree. There is also a reference to 7, which becomes 7 years. And suddenly we see a connection point of the 7 years of Nebuchadnezzar's dream with the 7 years of famine and of plenty in Egypt, according to Pharaoh's dream. We also read in the book of Ezra about their celebration of Passover, the same way that we celebrate both Passover and our salvation in Purim. We also see the language change from our ancient holy language of Hebrew to Aramaic, and we see how this process continues as we lose more and more connection, more proficiency and connection with our origins, our original Hebrew language. The evil of Nebuchadnezzar to the greatness of Choresh, with the return to Zion, the rebuilding of the temple, and its parallels from the Holocaust to the creation of the state of Israel, from the slavery of Egypt to the entrance to the promised land. We have our ups and we have our downs, and we must stay steadfast to Judaism, to Israel, and to the Jewish people. Thank you very much for watching this video. Toda lechem avur hatzfiya baseret hazeh. At this point, I'd like to tell you about some of the services that we offer. I teach B'nai Mitzvah, Bar and Bat Mitzvah, and we offer each student personalized training manual, a personalized interactive trainer to help them learn all of the lessons. We also give personalized help to each child for their personal development, giving them skills that will transcend just the bar and bat mitzvah. We also give them compelling lessons about their parsha, their haftarah, and you have seen in this video the unique knowledge, content, and insights that we have to the Torah, our heritage, Hebrew, and our heritage. We also offer Hebrew lessons, lessons in Torah, lessons in Tanakh, Judaics, and the most advanced Hebrew publication services available anywhere. We also try to build bridges to other communities within the Jewish people, to other religions, to people who revere the Bible, the Old Testament, sharing some of our love of the Hebrew and our Holy Scriptures. For further information, you can contact me at Eliezer.may@verizon.net. I would also like to add that we get no support whatsoever from any synagogues, from any Jewish schools or agencies, and everything that we are doing is dedicated to our love of Judaism, for the love of our heritage, the love of our children, and sharing our Torah with everyone we possibly can, without proselytizing, converting anyone, or trying to change anything about them, just to promote peace. Shalom lechulam. Peace upon you.